You're listening to the Singapore Africa Conversation.
So I wear two hats, although they serve the same function to drive trade and business interests from Singapore. I see companies along the different value chains coming in to say we are interested and finding the right opportunity for them to land on.
You're listening to the Singapore Africa Conversation, brought to you by the NTU-SBF Centre for African Studies. The Singapore Africa Conversation brings you the most compelling business conversations powered by the Centre's insightful research that is aimed at building capacity for doing business in Africa. Welcome to the Singapore Africa Conversation, where we explore how people and ideas are bridging the gap between Singapore and Africa's business landscape. Today, we're speaking with Jean Ng, who is Regional Director for West Central and Southern Africa at Enterprise Singapore. Welcome to the Singapore Africa Conversation, Jean. How are you?
I'm very good, Tessa. Hope everything's well on your end.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We're here to talk about the great work that you're doing in the regions that you represent, which are West, Central and Southern Africa. So, give us a brief introduction into who Jean Ng is.
Sure. Well, I have been with, the Enterprise Singapore team for the last decade. For the Africa work, I've been on the desk, about 7 to 8 years, including the time I spent in Singapore at our Africa desk, supporting the Africa work based in Singapore and learning the ropes in that sense before I had crossed over to my first posting in Ghana, looking at West and Central Africa. I've done that for the last 6 years, and I have now been transitioned into our Johannesburg office to also cover Southern Africa. So I cover both offices in Ghana as well as our office in Joburg. And in addition to that, because we have our High Commission Pretoria in South Africa, I am also the First Secretary Commercial for the High Commission of Singapore in South Africa. So I wear two hats at the moment, although they serve the same function in that sense to kind of drive trade and business interests from Singapore and vice versa for our country.
Thank you for sharing that. Today, we're looking at the work that you're doing in West and Southern Africa. So let's begin with your strategic lens in terms of what defines Enterprise Singapore's approach to West and Southern Africa.
I think the key distinction here to be made is that when we look at Sub-Saharan Africa and the African continent, it's 54 countries. It's all developing in various stages. South Africa would be considered the most developed on the continent in that sense because of their financial systems in place. Just the cities alone, if you Google them, you would see that the development is a lot more advanced compared to other cities. I'm not saying that the other cities on the continent are not developed, but they are at a later stage and are just coming up in that sense of development. And hence, if I look at it with that lens, then West Africa is developing, and therefore the approach for developing countries, the opportunities that you see on the ground and the different sectors and their needs would be different compared to, say, a South Africa where I'm currently based in, where, you're looking at more advanced sectors, more advanced needs, definitely more advanced challenges in that sense. And in that regard, sometimes it could be a higher barrier of entry to overcome. When I look at the Southern African markets, the neighboring countries around South Africa, their development phase is also slightly different, maybe a bit more advanced in some ways compared to the West African markets. So that's my perspective when I look at the strategic lens of, how can Singapore kind of contribute and tap on opportunities to collaborate on the ground.
So you've given us a great overview there in terms of how you see it from a strategic lens. So would you say that these are seen as opportunity-driven regions or long-term strategic bets?
Yes. Actually, I wouldn't go with the words opportunity-driven because I feel that it's a dual approach. I see as an opportunity-led kind of engagement across any of the markets that you pick, whether in West or Southern Africa. But the engagement with Africa always has to be a long-term kind of strategic bet in that sense, regardless of what sector you're coming into. It's not something whereby you can engage in and say, let me just come into this project and then stop doing Africa after that. It really doesn't work that way.
Thank you for that. As you mentioned earlier, you've got offices in Accra and Johannesburg where you're based. What would you say are the distinct roles these offices play?
For one, I think the Johannesburg office, we are the trade office under the High Commission. It really gives us a different slant to the work that we do. The perception on the ground, of course, is that we belong to the High Commission. And the reach and the breadth, say, for example, in terms of government-related work, it's a lot more takes place. It's a lot more active on this front, vis-a-vis for West Africa, because we are a standalone office. The focus there would be a lot more in the sense of private sector engagement. Not to say that we don't engage the government. We do. It's just that the focus on West Africa tends to be a lot more on the private sector B2B collaboration. Whereas for Johannesburg, we have to balance the government relations work that I do together with the office in terms of how do we drive more trade activity through different layers of whether we are reaching through government contacts, whether we're reaching through, say, key apex chambers on the ground for different industries, all the way to the private sector companies who are standalone, who are interested to engage and look at Singapore solutions.
So if we look at the opportunities that we're starting to see, we're seeing an increase or an emphasis on sustainability in infrastructure projects. For Singaporean companies actively participating in specialized logistics or port-related infrastructure projects in West or Southern Africa, what kind of support are they receiving?
Specific to the port and infrastructure sector, I guess the example I would draw here is in, say, for example, in South Africa, we have companies like your SMEC, SMEC, that's a subsidiary of Sabana Jurong. Most of the time when we speak to them, it's about how do we coalesce opportunities for them through our engagements, whether with government or with state-owned enterprises. Knowing how the thinking at the top goes sometimes can provide good feedback and good insights for our companies who are already operating on the ground. That's one level. If there are challenges that they're facing, it's usually a channel in which they will come and give us the feedback. And we appropriately, through different, discussions that we will have or contacts that we will also feed this back so that, at the end of the day, it's support that our companies would appreciate on the ground, that we also try to say, okay, this is how we can support you. And even in terms of some of the other channels, that if there's engagement in terms of like government feedback loops or focus groups that they do reach out to our High Commission and different embassies on the ground, those provide opportunities for us to then be able to address or raise certain issues that are pertinent to our companies and see, what could be resolved at the end of the day for that.
In addition to this, we're seeing increasing demand in areas such as green building, smart logistics. Can you let us know specifically how are Singaporean companies positioning themselves in these new demands?
I think if I look at the sustainability trend and I look at West Africa, for example, their needs quite widespread in this area. If I take the example of saying wanting to build a green residential development, the conversation with such a developer is quite wide, and therefore I could be pitching a whole basket of Singapore companies and their solutions to the developer on the ground in West Africa. And therefore it could be anything from water filtration systems to smart lighting or smart indoor fittings for the housing development at hand. Even right up to, say, carbon absorbing paints. Those are interesting solutions that we see have some level of attraction and interest it may take a while to land because sometimes developers are not ready to take on such products. Price point to consumer might be slightly higher at that point of time. But I've seen such conversations move in the last 2-3 years. And therefore, I go back to saying that it's opportunity-led and it's a long-term kind of conversation and bet that you have to kind of take to say, if I persevere, therefore, I will be rewarded at the end because the Singapore brand in that sense is trusted. And we seem to be able to deliver quality at a reasonable price point at the end of the day. If I look at Southern Africa, their issues for sustainability and their needs for sustainability is more developed. The need to kind of, I guess, implement larger scale, smarter technology. There is that market demand to address critical issues, right? Like energy optimization, water treatment, because water, I guess, scarcity is also one that is a pressing issue within South Africa. So such things demand a different kind of solution basket compared to, I guess, when I look at West Africa. And I see companies from Singapore along the different value chains coming in to say we are interested to kind of engage and finding the right opportunity for them to land on.
So if we keep on looking at some of the sectors which are generating interest, we know that the consumer sector in terms of West Africa consumer landscape is changing rapidly with e-commerce, fintech, and also a shifting consumer preference. Where would you say Singaporean companies are entering the value chain in that area?
Yeah, for West Africa, I think this is interesting sector to kind of unpack. I feel that for Singapore solutions coming in to kind of address the consumer technology space, some of the e-commerce kind of, let's say, live selling solutions, they've entered from Singapore into, say, markets like Nigeria. They've plugged into e-commerce platforms like Konga and Jumia. It's a matter of also fine-tuning and seeing how consumer habits on the ground impact certain buttons or functions that you would have on such e-commerce platforms, and what data points are you then tracking compared to, I say, some Southeast Asian market. So that's one space that I've seen some level of activity for e-commerce. For fintech, I think our payment solutions have, in the early days, done well in terms of some level of traction working with the financial institutions and the bank. I think now a lot of the African banks are also looking at going fully digital as a full digital bank versus having some level of retail banking presence on the ground. There are opportunities in this area in terms of a digital banking stack. But I feel that the next wave here really is in the area of AI solutions, things that we see and we take for granted, I think, in our Singapore banking applications. Actually, there are a host of Singapore companies that have supplied solutions to the banking apps that we see. And I see the same suite of solutions coming in to be able to work with not only the African banks, but the international banks on the ground in Africa. On the back end, their solutions are actually supported by Singapore company solutions. The next angle related to AI is, of course, in the area of consumer engagement, consumer stickiness on such platforms or applications, and also in terms of like the cybersecurity aspects. Those have been the touch points in which our companies have come in the consumer sector.
What would you say has been their real impact so far in the consumer sector?
I say that the impact here, and to my earlier response about consumer sector, I think we also need to recognize that our interest in terms of Singapore products, so buying and distributing some level of those kind of food products, for example, or even non-food products coming to markets like West Africa. And when I say non-food, take for example, the pets, grooming needs, pets, toys, for example, those kind of consumer products, all the way to like furniture. And I think our companies in this sense have had some level of distribution success. They've been able to sell into the market. If I look at the agri-commodity space, a lot of our agri-commodity traders from Singapore are also now doing processing and selling into the consumer segment on the ground. Those would be some of the impacts because they have been able to capture a lot of the value in market and look for opportunities in which they can tap into both the formal retail trade and the informal retail trade, selling products like custard powder, finished salted cashews, for example. Those are some of the products that we see. Of course, in the different segments, we've also seen impacts like being able to supply smart lighting solutions into housing developments, supplements, tea products. Those are some of these examples that they have taken time to find opportunities on the ground and therefore are now ready to kind of penetrate a lot further and deeper within the market for consumer demand.
We know that price sensitivity within informal retail still dominate large parts of the consumer market. How are you advising Singaporean companies to navigate this?
I think a valuable lesson to keep in mind is for Singapore companies who have engaged emerging Southeast Asian economies 10, 15 years back. This price sensitivity issue is one that they have overcome for Southeast Asia. When you come into the same African market that has a similar issue of price sensitivity, some level of flexibility needs to take place in terms of how you look at the product that you're trying to bring into the market and be able to adapt to such feedback. Meaning, can I make my consumer packaging size smaller? Can I basically be able to then address both the informal trade, which then requires you to sell a larger volume? So maybe you're selling a different packaging size to the wholesale trader who sits in Makola market in Ghana, for example, right? And therefore they're able to break bulk and sell it on the ground to a per day user compared to someone like a supermarket chain that you're then trying to sell, I guess, some level of formalized package. Even then, what is the packaging size that actually works versus, say, a family pack size that may not be able to move as much volume because the consumer shopping in the supermarket can't afford a family pack size, but they're willing to buy a 1 kg packet because it's sufficient for the family at this point of time. Understanding some of those nuances and being flexible and also understanding that, look, you're here for the long-term game. So flexibility in your price point and I guess sometimes being able to recognize that you can't really have your pie at this point of time. Not to say that you must cut back on profitability, but if you take a minor cut into profitability now, you get a larger market size that can then follow you and give you consistent profits down the road. That flexibility in thinking also needs to take place so that you're not going to be kicked out of the consumer market because people can't afford you at the end of the day.
Thank you for sharing that. So if we move from West Africa and look at Southern Africa, we know Southern Africa is known for its resource wealth, but there is a clear pivot towards renewable energy. Are Singaporean firms engaging with this shift?
Yes, in very selective fronts. I would admit that renewable energy, when we look at Southern Africa, immediately everyone thinks of solar energy. I think it's hard to compete in this space, given the traction that I guess the Chinese producers of solar energy solutions and even some level of the security solutions that we see on the ground have been here for a while. I think Singapore companies would play in very niche areas. And I go back again to say in the requirements of energy optimization, some of the technology solutions that we use in Singapore, those will be required and are being sought after in the market that, you don't really have much competition at the end of the day. And therefore, you can afford to play in this aspect when it comes to renewable energy. I think there are other aspects of our renewable energy solutions, for example, even in floating solar that can come into the market. But it's, again, finding the right opportunities and kind of socializing it to the Singapore solution providers at the same time because it's a competitive market out there. I can understand the predicament that Singapore companies have to choose where they kind of enter most of the time, Asia takes up the bulk of their energy because it's just the backyard. But sometimes coming further away into South Africa has good opportunities, and your market is less competitive, so you stand out quite easily. So that's where we see Singapore companies, and we've been also pushing for Singapore solutions to then come into the space of renewable energy because it's prime and, the market can receive other options at the end of the day.
We know that Singapore signed a bilateral carbon credit implementation agreement with Ghana this year. What would you say this signals about Singapore's intention in the region?
I think it signals our readiness to even look at some of these future economy segments. I think the green circular economy is one that is actively talked about, and in the space of carbon credits, Singapore has put its best foot forward to kind of say, we will look at this space, and it's not just all talk. What can we do to kind of cement our seriousness? And therefore, you see a lot of, the first move of implementation agreements being signed with Ghana. I think there's also interest in East Africa for countries like Kenya and Rwanda that's in the talks, and some of the actions in this area. So it cements our seriousness in this aspect of supporting, enabling, African countries to say we can do a lot more with our resources that we have.
Brilliant. So from this, would you say, or have you seen any private sector deals emerging from this framework?
Yes, I would say that they are in the works. I am aware that from the Ghana implementation agreements, I know that 11 projects have been approved at the stage A part of the approval process for projects to be looked at under our bilateral IA with Ghana. A lot of these projects are in water treatment and clean cooking, cook stove projects. And as the white list expands, we will also then be able to look at other projects that are coming out on the ground. So there are also active private sector conversations that also involve our Singapore companies to do project development for carbon credits on the ground, to be able to do MRO services on such projects. And a lot of it is tied to kind of how soon regulatory approval can be also given.
Keeping with the theme of projects and deals, are there any examples that you can share with us with regards to deals, projects, or partnerships in West or Southern Africa where you feel Enterprise Singapore made a difference between the idea and the actual execution?
Yes, I think if I look at, say, for example, the infrastructure space, interest in understanding whether your local partner in this space of airport management is worthwhile to engage with the help of our officers on the ground and us doing the work together with the Singapore company at hand. It helps them to kind of ride the wave, even though there's change of government administration, say in Nigeria. And therefore, at the end of the day, even though they know who their local partner is the assurance that we have provided for the Singapore company to then put in a bid, the advice that we can then also give them at the end of the day to say, with this change of administration, you will need to look at other areas together with the local partner. That kind of makes the execution part where we make a difference at the end. There are also other examples, I guess, even in the commodity segment, where maybe the intention here is to only be able to do the particular trade in one way. And with the help of our office, of course, we then bring in other options, open up other insurance options so that our companies feel a lot more comfortable executing the trade at the end. So those are kind of the success stories that I've seen. There's so many others that I can think of, but I think this two would kind of say this is how we help our companies on the ground when it comes to just an idea and execution.
I guess if we look at it from the other side, conversely, where things possibly have not worked, what are some of the lessons Enterprise Singapore or a Singaporean company has learned in these regions?
Losing money always is a hard lesson to learn. Sometimes it's inevitable that school fees have to be paid in that sense. And we try as much as possible to mitigate that risk or to advise against certain actions. But at the end of the day, it's either the nature of the industry. So therefore, sometimes some of these small school fees unfortunately have to be lost. But we try as much as possible. We are not the one who makes the commercial decision at the end of the day, but we try as much as possible to alleviate and avoid such situations for our companies if it can be helped. But I think the painful lesson is always when money is lost.
I agree. So looking ahead, as we look to the next Africa Singapore Business Forum and beyond, what does success in West and Southern Africa look like to you?
I think the first touch point here as a measurement of success is, of course, the increase in the number of Singapore companies that will look to enter or are entering into Africa to do more business. That's always a good sign. I remember that in 2018, when I did NTU-SBF, still being based in Singapore, it was only about 60 Singapore companies that were doing business or operating on the ground. In 2021, just after COVID, when we did the next edition of NTU-SBF at the point of time, it was significant progress that our Singapore companies have doubled in terms of the interest. So we were looking at about 120 companies who have entered into Africa to do business on the continent. So the numbers, I guess, don't lie, and that's a good yardstick of measurement. I think if I look at a layer below, it's really looking at, for myself, the success of how Singapore companies can then address specific challenges and that they've been brought into for the different countries that you're at. For South Africa, if a Singapore company at the end of the day is able to gain success to do energy management or wastewater treatment for South Africa, that then has some level of impact to the population or even to a development at the end of the day, that is success, because it's something that I feel it's great. You've addressed a specific challenge in a specific market for its people.
So what role do you see Western Southern Africa playing at the next Africa Singapore Business Forum?
That's an interesting question. I think it would be, for West Africa, it would be exciting to see what is the next wave of sectorial needs. And it's not always going to be that basic. I think West Africa is coming up in terms of even able to say that hopefully in advanced manufacturing, for example, and some of the advanced sectors like precision medicine that we look at, it may not be where our solutions can land, but it's not a forever never landing point. And if in the next edition, this could be something that West Africa says this is what we need, and therefore it's a highlighted trend in the forum, I think that's a good contribution. For Southern Africa, really in terms of the technology wave, what else is new, what else can be done to kind of also raise the bar in South Africa and in the Southern African markets. I think that would be also exciting to look at in the next NTU-SBF.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Jean. So we've come to the end of today's conversation, which has been a great conversation. Thank you for unpacking the role Enterprise Singapore is playing in West and Southern Africa, from supporting infrastructure, transformation, and logistics to also the shifting energy and consumer space. I think from what we've discussed today and in previous episodes, it's clear that creating lasting impact in these regions requires more than just capital. It requires collaboration and also the cultural understanding and presence on the ground. So thank you for your time today, Jean. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure as well.
Fantastic. And we will speak soon.
Right. Take care.
Take care. You've been listening to the Singapore Africa Conversation, brought to you by the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies. Join us next time for more Africa-focused business conversations.